Good afternoon. Let's see. I think we have, I think more people are still coming in, but I think we're going to get started because we have so much to cover. Welcome to the webinar, Cutting Child Poverty in Half and More, Pandemic Era Lessons from Child and Family Advocates and Organizers. I'm Olivia Golden. I'll be moderating the panel. I'm a senior policy advisor for the Foundation for Child Development, co-author of the paper that my co-author Vivian Tsang will be presenting. And I am thrilled to see in the registration list lots of people that I know from my past and my future as a child advocate in the nonprofit and public sectors. So wonderful to have you. This is the first webinar in a planned series hosted by the Foundation for Child Development. The focus is to connect the world of child and family advocacy, organizing, policy, and research with the world of racial and immigrant justice. And you can see why this connection is so important to advancing good policy for children and families when you look at who children are in the United States today. More than half of US children in the latest census are children of color, and something like a quarter are children in immigrant families. So this webinar series is part of the Foundation's broader journey to explore what it means to be a social justice funder for young children. Another part of that journey that you may want to check out is the blog series on FCD's webpage. So focusing in on today, I am very excited about the conversation today. As of yesterday, we had almost 400 people signed up, and I'm seeing your names go by me in the chat. Tons of different perspectives, researchers, advocates, organizers, state and national public sector leaders, people who work in direct service in early care and K through 12 education and healthcare, people in philanthropy, journalists. So it's an incredibly rich group, and thank you all for being here. That does mean that we may not, in fact, get to every specific question that would address every single perspective, but we're going to do our best to cut across the content with this amazing panel. My goals for the conversation are three. The first is to share key lessons from the paper with a focus on what insights are useful and practical going forward. The second is to hear from our four amazing panelists. I'm going to introduce them in a moment. They have just a range of incredible insight to share. And finally, I am hoping that the conversation will be practical and inspiring both. And that's a lot, but this is the moment when I think we all need both things. We need the practical and we need some inspiration. So I'm going to introduce everyone in a moment, but first, just a quick review of the format we're going to use to achieve those goals. We're going to begin with Vivian presenting key points from the paper. Then I'll turn to the four amazing panelists, Britannia Brown, Dorian Warren, Fred Jones, and Adriana Cadena, to offer initial thoughts. Then I'm going to be starting the conversation going among the panelists. And during all this, please put your questions into the Q&A. We're going to be using the Q&A tab, not the chat, as the place we gather all the questions. And then in the last 20 minutes or so of the webinar, I'll turn to those Q&As and we'll use audience questions to guide us. So that's where we'll be drawing what we hope will be lots of engagement. So now let me tell you briefly who these amazing presenters are. And I think you'll find detailed bios on the website. We're going to begin with Dr. Vivian Tsang. Vivian waves, so they see you. She's the president and chief executive officer of the Foundation for Child Development, and previously was senior vice president for programs at the William T. Grant Foundation. As you will hear, she's passionate about research that truly connects to policy, to practice, to the lived experience of communities, and her whole career reflects an abiding commitment to racial equity. She received her PhD from NYU and her BA from UCLA. Once we get to the panel, the next person to speak will be Britannia Brown. Britannia, wave. Britannia Brown is an early childhood organizer with Community Change Action. She's the proud mother of boy-girl twins, an early educator, and a childcare visionary at Our Loving Village in Stanford, Texas. In addition to being an educator, she's a national and state level advocate and community organizer for early care and education, for childcare changemakers, and the Childcare for Every Family Network. Then we're going to turn to Dorian Warren. Dorian, let people know you're there. He's the president of Community Change and co-chair of the Economic Security Project and co-host of System Check. I see we have fan mail in the chat, by the way, as I'm introducing people. Please feel free to put in your fan mail. Everybody will appreciate it. So Dorian is a progressive scholar, organizer, and media personality who has worked to advance racial, economic, and social justice for more than 2 decades, including teaching for over a decade at the University of Chicago and Columbia University, and serving as a contributor and host at MSNBC. He grew up on the South Side of Chicago, received his BA from the University of Illinois, and his MA and PhD in political science from Yale University. And he's an amazing colleague, I can say, from my life in the nonprofit sector. Then we're going to turn to Fred Jones. Fred, there you are. Great, right under me on the screen. Fred is the Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Southern Education Foundation, including overseeing a new early childhood initiative called the Southern Early Childhood Education Justice Initiative. The Southern Education Foundation has an extraordinary 150-year history, a grounding in racial justice. And Fred came to that role with diverse experience, first working for the U.S. House of Representatives Education and Labor Committee, and then through multiple roles since, gaining policy and advocacy experience from early childhood development through post-secondary. He has a bachelor's degree in political science from Tufts and an MBA from the University of Maryland. And then finally, we're going to close with Adriana Cadena. Adriana, let people know you're there, who's the director of the Protecting Immigrant Families Coalition, which she joined in early 2022, and she grew the coalition to an extraordinary national size of more than 650 member organizations at the intersection of immigration, immigrant families on the one hand, and the core public supports like health and nutrition and economic supports on the other hand, all working together to increase and expand access for immigrant families. She brings to this work more than 20 years of experience in advancing the well-being of low-income immigrants through organizing, advocacy, and organizational leadership. And she grounds herself in the everyday challenges faced by her community on the US-Mexico border and her own experience as an undocumented immigrant child growing up in a small Texas town. Welcome to this amazing panel. You can see the extraordinary range of perspectives they're going to bring to us. And with that, let me turn it over to Vivian for the highlights from the paper. Vivian.
Thank you so much, Olivia. I am just thrilled to be on this panel. I have to say, I actually feel quite honored to be on this panel with people who have worked so hard to bring about some of the achievements that we'll talk about today and who have generated many of the lessons that we'll be talking about today. But let me back up a little bit and talk about the origin story of this paper. Like, how did we even get to this paper? How did we get to this webinar? Why is the Foundation for Child Development interested in all this? Let me start there. And it really goes back to when I started the foundation. I came in at the very end of 2022. And as new leaders are apt to do, we're trying to figure out, well, how can we make a difference? The Foundation for Child Development has a long history of really putting young children at the center of our concerns. We are very concerned about equity and justice for these kids. And what can we do to make a difference? And so early on, I was thinking a lot about what some of the core underlying problems are. And I was thinking about this chronic underinvestment in kids in this country. It seems to me there's a lot of things we look at, but underneath a lot of it is just this chronic underinvestment in kids. And so I was just wondering, is there a way into this problem? Or is it just an unrealistic vision? Because it's chronic, it's widespread. Is there something that's possible? Or is it a pipe dream? And luckily, I spoke with Olivia Golden as I was mulling over these big questions. And Olivia said, well, actually, Vivian, the government just did that. They just put in a massive investment in children and families. It was an unprecedented set of policy reforms. And that large scale investment was actually impactful. It cut child poverty in half. And it did it very quickly. You know, around a few years before that, the National Academy of Sciences had put out this report about what it would take to cut child poverty in half in a decade. Because that was, I think, as big as we could dream as how to do it in a decade. But actually, we did it. This country did it in a year or two. And so that's kind of striking in and of itself. And so, what was this extraordinary departure from history? Well, it was a massive investment, right? And it was investment across multiple areas that affect families' economic stability, employment, housing, health, nutrition, education. It was really a broad set of investments. And to me, as a developmental psychologist, a lifelong person who's put children at the center of my work and my career, I think that just makes sense because when I think about what children need, it is all of these things, right? And so that this kind of investment that thinks about their lives in a holistic way and the needs of their families in a holistic way, that just makes intuitive sense to me. And I think probably intuitive sense to anyone who has kids and who has nieces and nephews. And then the other thing is this extraordinary departure from history also thought about our entire service systems as well. So here I think about, for example, the $50 billion investment in the childcare industry, which was about to collapse. It was just on the precipice. And so it was a thinking about a system, broad scale investments in a system. And another thing I think, given my commitment to racial equity, and I know those of the panelists here, that was an inclusive attention to children of color and to children in immigrant families. And, you know, as Olivia said, you know, if we're thinking about the future of this country, we have to think about children of color. They're now half, a little over half of our child population. So as we start to think about our future, we can just look at these kids. They are the future of our country and they're very diverse. And at least part of that is a growing population of children of immigrant families who themselves are living very different kinds of lives and have different statuses and face different kinds of challenges. But what's amazing, I think, about this set of policy reforms is that they really put the lived experience, the realities of these families at the center of thinking about policy development and implementation. And I think what it showed us when poverty also halved for these groups, for children in immigrant families, for children of Black families, for Latino families, what we learned is that we can have inclusive policy reform. We do not need to sacrifice one group of children for another group of children. Our country can care for all of our kids, and we just have to be intentional about it. We have to be really intentional about it. So, with that, compelling kind of story that Olivia's laid out, we said, well, let's set out to figure out what brought about this remarkable set of policy reforms. Let's dig in. We had some ideas and things to draw from, but let's really dig in. And what we particularly wanted to do is to learn from advocates, organizers, and coalition leaders. We wanted to hear from the people who had a part in making it happen, because we recognize that this kind of thing doesn't just happen. There are a lot of people working hard who've been laying the groundwork for this kind of change. So there was taking a longer look back about what happened in the lead up to this. And then we also knew there was a lot of seizing opportunities as they arose too. So in the sort of more immediate term, seizing opportunities and probably creating opportunities, right? When the early COVID days and things were being discussed. So we wanted to understand that as well. And so we tried to identify the lessons learned. And so through our conversations with organizers, with advocates, with coalition and movement leaders, um, and with some researchers and based on our own experience, we identified 5 lessons that are shown in this paper. I'm not going to be able to go into depth on all of them, but I would refer people to the paper, which is being posted in the chat. It's also available on our website. But let me just briefly say what the 5 lessons were. One, center families with lived experience, that the families that are closest to the impacts of injustice should be at the table in thinking through what kind of policy reforms are needed, implemented, and all of that. Two, another lesson was this extraordinary sort of expansion and strength of coalitions because they engaged families, care workers, and allies. So broader base. Third, we learned some lessons about federal and state strategies, and that this is a reciprocal relationship. It's not just one leading to the other, one implementing the other's policies, but really thinking about this reciprocal dynamic relationship between federal and state. Fourth, we learned lessons about strengthening coalition infrastructure, that boy, coalition work doesn't also happen on its own, and figuring out what it takes to strengthen coalition infrastructure. And then the fifth, which really hit me, was this need for sustained long-term efforts. Because as you hear, it wasn't just something that happened in a moment. There was a buildup, there was a foundation that was laid that enabled this to happen. And so for me, it's expanding. I just want to say here, for me as a funder, was thinking about expanding our definition of success, our definition of wins and losses, and what does it mean, so that we're looking beyond the moment, we're thinking longer term. And that even when we lose a vote in a legislative session, let's say, you might think of that as a loss. But if you're thinking about power built over the course of a campaign, then you're thinking about a win for the longer term. When you think about the relationships and alliances that are built, even if a legislative vote is lost, that can be seen as a win for the longer term. And so as I return back to our origin story for this paper and this work, and my question of like, is there a way into this problem? Is there hope for our country, or is it just, an unrealistic vision? I think the answer is yes, it can be done. In fact, it has been done. And makes me optimistic to think that we can do it again. And even more optimistically, I think we can do it even better, even more inclusively, and in a more sustained way. Because what happened was we did see child poverty drop in half, and then we saw it soar right back up again when the reforms ended. So that wasn't an uptake, but I'm optimistic about what we can accomplish. And so I'm really looking forward to learning from my fellow panelists and exploring further with them what other lessons should we be drawing, and what can we do to take this work forward in the future.
Thank you so much, Vivian. That was incredibly crisp. And I just want to underline your point at the end, which was this all ended. And many people have tried to mine the lessons of why did it end, what went wrong. And I think what Vivian was highlighting is that there are powerful lessons from looking both at what worked and potentially at why it ended. And I think we're going to draw all of those out today. So we're going to start our conversation with Britannia. And Britannia, you can unmute. And what I would love to hear from you, you bring this extraordinary perspective as someone who has lived experience as a parent, as a childcare provider, I think you said as a doula, maternal health. What resonates for you from these lessons, given your perspective?
Well, thank you so much, Olivia and Vivian, for the opportunity to talk about this. Again, my name is Britannia Brown. I'm so honored to share my story with y'all today. As a multi-passionate advocate and activist, as Olivia mentioned, I'm really passionate about a lot of things, but I've also experienced firsthand the challenges of navigating this broken childcare system. As a mother, I struggle to find quality, affordable childcare for my twins, despite being in the early education field. I had several certifications in early childhood education, but nothing really prepared me for the struggle I face, especially throughout the pandemic. But before that, It led me to creating my own licensed home childcare program called Our Loving Village and later a center to become the solution to my own problem. But my journey did not end there, unfortunately. I've spent years navigating the challenges of this childcare system, finding solutions with other advocates, and fighting for the rights of early educators like myself. And through it all, I've actually learned that our struggles are interconnected in this broader scope that encompasses mental health, childcare, paid leave, and other essential services that are all part of this fight for a stronger care economy. I remember sharing my story with others and realizing, hey, I'm not alone. There were countless numbers of families and early educators who were facing similar challenges. And so I began to organize and bring our voices together to demand this change when I joined Community Change's Childcare Changemakers campaign and the Childcare for Every Family Network as an organizer. I started to build this community of visionaries who shared my vision for this stronger care economy, and we saw firsthand the power of storytelling and taking collective action that really drove change for our industry. I cannot stress enough like how important storytelling is because movement leaders, especially Black and Brown women, really need protections from the support of this systemic oppression on our voices. Our stories need to be lifted up in meaningful ways that inform research and other ways to advocate because the leadership of parents and educators across the nation is crucial to manufacturing state level progress and national childcare reform. We're the proximity experts. And even though we faced these losses along the way, especially back when Build Back Better was defeated, even in that defeat, we found a way to turn our struggles into strength. I remember the month after Build Back Better didn't pass, I made a commitment as an organizer to talk to 125 people and have conversations with parents and educators to see what they wanted to do. And those conversations were so valuable at the time. It sparked a fire in so many other people and led me to propose the first ever contemporary strike for childcare, which evolved into our Day Without Childcare campaign. And that childcare campaign just celebrated its third annual event, making national news and showing the power of collective action. But our work doesn't stop there. I really learned that the sustainability for the Southern care economy is really crucial to my own personal experience, and that we need to approach it with a firm racial and gender justice lens. We need to continue to amplify the voices of especially BIPOC and Latinx communities. And we also need to support their leadership directly because we deserve to be at the table and we need to have a willingness to take risks in state and local campaigns that really prioritize our communities and our voices, not just for our votes during election season or for short-term projects, because we are the people who are closest to the problem and we often have the solution. We are lighting the flame and passing the torch, and we are the visionaries in our own village. But when our fires and flames are burning low, we must really learn how to lean on each other. So I hope to encourage other people and empower other people to engage on this issue. I personally want to say that we need funders to invest in the developing of leaders in this, because again, we are the proximity experts. And we also need policymakers to and other state-based organizations to welcome us to their table or join ours. So yeah, that is kind of where I'd say where my experience got. Thanks, Olivia.
Thank you so much. I just want to encourage people to put your questions in the Q&A. And since you were so brief, I'm going to just ask you to draw out one thing slightly more, Britannia. You talked about BBB, and just there are probably plenty of people who don't know what that is. It's the acronym for a piece of legislation called Build Back Better that would have made these temporary gains in the pandemic response permanent and would have added some others. But can you just do one or two sentences on the point that you made in the middle of your great points that underline Vivian's point about what really is a success? How do you think about that in the work you do? Just really briefly, what is a success in this work?
Yeah, so I feel like a success of Build Back Better and other legislation that has been proposed across the national sphere has really given an opportunity for parents and educators to come and other community supporters to come and have dialogue about how legislators are proposing certain languages about our lived experience. One thing I've always said is that we do not want policy to impact our personal and practical lives. And with Build Back Better, we got to learn what we loved about it, what we didn't like, and we got to suggest and build relationships with our elected officials through that kind of advocacy.
That's great. Thank you. So it's a success when people get stimulated to do that, and there's mechanisms. I'll
Mhm.
turn next to Dorian Warren, who brings a broad national policy and organizing and research perspective altogether. Dorian, what resonated for you? What do you want to add?
Thank you, Olivia. Thanks to both you and Vivian for writing this fantastic paper, of which I have lots of thoughts. And I just want to say it is always so hard to follow Britannia because she said all the words, and I was just over here saying yes, yes, yes. So thank you, Lita Brown, for your work. So 3 quick points on what resonated for me in the paper. And I have to say, having read, I don't know, Vivian, like over 20 years, we probably read thousands of papers. Reading papers, I don't generally get excited. And as Vivian and Olivia will tell you, I got so excited reading this paper because the story that they tell is so important for all of us to digest and to walk around. And so the first point is the story really matters. And the story of success really matters because it's important when you're doing this work to take the wins, and especially even if they're temporary, we have to take the wins and we have to tell the story of the wins. And we haven't been very good at that. I would be quick to add that we also have not been good at telling the counterfactual story. That is, what would have happened but for these interventions that Vivian and Olivia describe in their paper. So you might imagine a scenario, and we know this, going into the pandemic-induced economic crisis, based on our previous experiences, particularly in 2007, 2008, 2009, you could imagine this playing out in a different way. We could imagine austerity, and that was actually on the table for a moment. And cutting things, not actual historic investments. We could imagine doubling of child poverty, not having it. So the counterfactual of what wouldn't have happened, I think, is really important to talk about. We know that people would have been plunged into hunger, into homelessness, into unemployment would have been huge, even larger. So that's the first point. Telling the story and also telling the counterfactual, so we understand, as they do so beautifully in their paper, we understand what are the factors and what are the conditions that led to success here. Point 2, I want to mention power and power building here. There is at least a decade of organizing, of playing a long game, of building power that led up to the moment in 2020 and 2021 for these historic investments. And you can actually play back the clock and just track the organizing in the decade actually between the Great Recession to the pandemic recession of providers, of care providers, of parents, of organizing around cash, of organizing around childcare and early learning. I'm thinking back to several major state level campaigns in 2016 and 2018, in particular around childcare, where it was put on the agenda in a really big way. It makes me think in the last decade of the work of the Fight for 15 that put wages on the table, but from a grassroots organizing perspective that was inspiring to, I know, Britannia and many other childcare providers and parents who saw a route of collective action. So just to say that, and they say this in the, both Olivia and Vivian say this in the paper, like this didn't come out of nowhere. There was a long game of power building that led to this moment in 2021. And the last point on this PowerPoint, so to speak, we also, at least the lesson for me is we have to build power after a win. And what I mean by that is when we're in the implementation stage, and we have a lot of lessons here from the temporary expanded child tax credit of one, making sure it's implemented well so that people who are eligible actually get the benefits. and the uptake is at 100%, but also using that implementation work to build more long-term power, to recruit more people into civic action as part of implementation. That is the power building after a win that I think is necessary, and of which, frankly, there was little investment in the midst. So many of us were saying we need to invest in implementation of the child tax credit and power building. And so that's one lesson for the future. When we do win, even if they're temporary, we need a strategy for power building. Last but not least, Olivia, third point, coalition building and building new kinds of solidarities. And Britannia mentioned this already. There is strength in solidarity, and everyone has a role in this movement and in this struggle. And we can only get there by building and expanding coalitions. In our case at Community Change and with Childcare Changemakers, it's solidarities between both providers and parents and families. And as I think Britannia is actually the perfect example of someone who sits right at the intersection. She is both a provider and a parent, right? It's not separate identities. She literally embodies the intersection of those identities. So how do we think about building solidarities that we haven't done a good job of in our history and past, but we actually have done pretty well in the last several years of bringing together different groups and stakeholders in our movement and ecosystem, and frankly, in some cases, unlikely allies in lots of places. So building solidarity among and across our ecosystem is really important. And I'll stop there and toss it back to you, Olivia.
Thank you, Dorian. That was amazing. I just want to encourage everybody to put their comments in or their questions into the Q&A. I'm seeing comments in the chat. And Dorian, that last point about the fact that in the early childhood world and maybe in other worlds, we have not always in the long past done a really good job of connecting the staff and parents, I think is really important and something that many people on this webinar may have experience or comments about. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Fred Jones with the work at the Southern Educational Foundation with its extraordinary civil rights history and the new work on early childhood, or I guess expanded work. What resonated for you?
Well, thank you, Olivia. I really appreciate the opportunity to serve on this panel with such amazing professionals who are doing great work. And I just want to, again, thank the foundation for letting SEF serve on this panel. This paper really underscores the longstanding failure of the U.S. to invest adequately in young children, and especially those from historically underserved communities. This resonates deeply with the Southern Education Foundation's mission to advocate for low-income children and children of color all throughout the South. The federal policy reforms during the pandemic that have child poverty are really a testament to what can be achieved with targeted investments in strategic advocacy going forward. There are really three things that I want to also highlight based off of what I read in this amazing, amazing paper. And I also want to just plus 10 to everything my two colleagues just said on this panel as well. I agree with everything that they said, and I hope to add just a little bit more color as well. But it's very important, I think, at least to us in our approach to our work, is taking a dual approach in federal and state policy and advocacy. It's really important to have this deliberate federal and state strategy to achieve equity, as the paper highlights. The feds, as many of you know, the primary duty is to ensure children have their civil rights protected and maintained in the education system. And I also think it's a moral obligation for the federal government to also advance equity, especially as we see so many states turn away from programs and funding that would disproportionately improve the lives of families and children of color all throughout this nation. The paper goes into some specifics such as Medicaid expansion, but also there is an attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion, both at the higher ed levels, the K-12 level, and also in the early learning system as well. That's unfortunate. At SEF, we focus our advocacy efforts at the state level in the South, but also very much so a strategic advocacy effort at the federal level. We're doing this in part through our new initiative called the Southern Early Childhood Education Justice Network, which is a network of diverse ECE advocates all throughout the South working to advance racial equity by advancing ECE policies both at the state level and at the federal level. the emphasis for us is incredibly important to make sure that there is this dual strategy to ensure that we can achieve equity. In our network, we focus on multiple levels, advocating for policies Congress can respond to support early care and learning opportunities across the South. And we're also working with state partners to adopt a number of policies that we outline. This includes things like more pay for early learning professionals, such as efforts that we supported in Georgia, but also looking to lower costs for families as targeted advocacy strategies at the federal level. We've learned to take multiple bites at the apple, especially if we're looking to achieve systems level change in the South. So we need this federal and state effort. The second thing I wanted to just pull out is building inclusive and powerful coalitions. The paper does an awesome job of describing the importance of this. Success, I think, in any coalition really depends on its ability to expand the coalition to include a diverse group of stakeholders with multiple voices, with multiple power, and who all have the ability to participate equally. By bringing together diverse stakeholders, including policy organizations, parents, community leaders, we have, at least at SCF, we are continuing to build a powerful regional coalition of advocates that can comprehensively support a number of early childhood education policies. In the network that I just mentioned, we are trying to be very intentional to ensure that as we expand our coalition, it's a diversity of different types of people, their roles, their impacting communities, and in their professional background as well, so that we can focus on serving as many children and care providers as possible. And then the last thing I just want to say, and I think the most important lesson that's in the paper is the ability to center families with lived experiences. As was mentioned earlier by my colleague on this panel, is parents and families. Those are the proximity experts who have real stories and the ability to change hearts and minds in ways that numbers will simply never be able to do. They're able to identify real practice and tangible policy changes. I think also families and other proximity experts can provide recommendations and outline unintended consequences of policy changes in ways that those who are not impacted would never be able to do. So it's important that we center families to help avoid any unintended consequences, but also identify, I think, systems level policy recommendations that actually can change the conditions of people over time and not are just technical solutions. In closing, at least just overall for this part, what I just want to highlight is the Southern Education Foundation has a long storied history. We're over 155 years old, and we were formed just after the Civil War to help the formerly enslaved population establish a school system in the South. And now today we work from a birth through post-secondary completion standpoint in advocacy, research, and leadership development. I really just want to thank the foundation for its effort to focus on the South. At least a portion of this paper really highlighted the importance of the families and children who are living in the Southern region. As what was noted earlier, the majority of children of color and low-income students reside in the South. And specifically, the majority of those students in the South reside in 3 states, which include Texas, Florida, and Georgia alone. And in general, nearly 60% of Black children in the US live in the South. There's really no way to shift long-term outcomes in our nation without centering these states and the Southern region. In closing, I just want to emphasize that we need to continue to focus on just policies and programs, but focusing on the South. And I just really wanted to thank everyone for your time and attention. I look forward to our discussion and Q&A afterwards.
Thank you so much. And I just want to note, we have a lot of participants from all over the country, including a bunch of Southern states. I know I noticed North Carolina, Texas, Georgia, I think, maybe Florida. And obviously, we also welcome questions from people. I saw lots of other states, Illinois and California and New York. So we really are looking forward to that. Please put your questions in the Q&A. Adriana, and your role leading this extraordinary coalition, which we've been talking about coalitions a lot, you have a close-up view of both what's easy and what's hard about broadening the tent, bringing the immigration justice world and the child and family and income and health worlds together. What resonates for you?
Hi, Olivia. Hello, everyone. And thank you. I'm so excited to be here with all my co-panelists and with Vivian and Olivia, who just developed this amazing paper that really lays out, I think, and puts into place what we need to be able to do and be able to work towards as we try to address inequality in our country and build equity in healthcare and public benefits. So thank you first. Just to reintroduce myself, I'm Adriana Cadena. I'm the director for the Protecting Immigrant Families Coalition that is known as PIF. And we bring together leading national, state, and local advocates that work on immigrant rights, children, education, health, anti-hunger, and anti-poverty groups together to lay that foundation where we have a future where everyone has access and respect and receive the care they need, regardless of where they were born. And so it's a very, as you can probably imagine, it's a very challenging task in bringing together this diversity into our coalition, but it's also extremely effective to achieve wins. And so how PIF was born was precisely as a campaign brought together by the National Immigration Law Center and the Center on Law Social Policy at the time that actually Olivia was at the head of the organization. And we came together to address one particular issue under the Trump administration, which was the issue of public charge. A new public charge rule that essentially created a lasting chilling effect that prevented immigrant families, their children, from accessing life-saving supports. And so through this experience, not only were we able to halt as much as possible this new public charge rule, but also we were able to build relationships, build coalitions, and have the new Biden administration actually implement a new public charge rule that was more friendly, that was more clear in terms of who would be considered public charge and who would not be. So when I look at this paper and what we had a chance to review, there is three main areas, obviously, that I think it really resonates with me. The first, in working and coming from organizing immigrant communities and working directly with the many organizations that address the needs of immigrant communities. The first thing that is extremely important for us is that in order to achieve equity in our country, we cannot leave out immigrant communities. We have to be inclusive of communities. We have to understand the challenges they face, from language barriers to fears of immigration, to understanding the systems that exist, to simply understanding where to go for help. And so when Build Back Better was created and immigrant communities were left out of the stimulus package, it was a tremendous impact in these communities. And even though we, through our coalition and with other allies, were able to make some fixes to that, it wasn't enough. We know it was not enough. What helped us to fix was the fact that we had these allies and that we could go to our allies and we could say, we need your voice in this effort and we need you to be a champion for communities who they may not necessarily be addressing specifically immigrant issues. But what we also learned is that it was the response, and I think Dorian pointed out to this, it was the response of grassroots organizations working at a very ground level, working with immigrant communities who immediately worked to build funds so that they could provide support to communities themselves. It was, as they called it in El Paso, people-to-people funding. That's how we were able to keep and lift immigrants who were left out of this process to receive cash assistance, which was extremely important to address childcare, food, housing, every single need that they had. And so I think when we think about it, it being inclusive, we have to think at the beginning of the design of a policy. It cannot be an afterthought. And so we have to be at the table, as Brianna mentioned. That lived experience needs to be at the table so that we inform our advocates, we inform our allies of why this is important. And the other is that, when we looked at, and that the other I think it's important to understand is also that we have to be able to, the second thing that I want to mention is that we have to be able to make the connections, and that the paper lays out of federal and state agencies and connect that to coalition building. And so, we, as PIF was created, PIF was born addressing this particular issue, we found that it was so important at a very localized level, and coalitions organically form at a state level, replicating what PIF at a national level was, which was diverse sector coalitions. And so this allowed for state level coalitions to also begin to expand access to benefits within their states. And so that expansion of benefits, for instance, so that legal permanent residents who currently are barred at a federal level to receive federally qualified benefits could make, at the state level, we could work to remove those restrictions, and actually states could cover the people who would fall within the 5-year bar, which was a legal permanent residence. And also states and our coalition members began to work on expanding so that healthcare, for instance, was available to undocumented immigrants, like we have seen in states like California and in some other states. They're really looking to expand. So what the paper lays out is that, one, we need to ensure that we are working at a state level to remove exclusions and remove barriers, make that connection to a federal level so that we can push later on to ensure that those barriers are removed for everyone at a national level. And then two, that connects us back to coalition building, because we obviously cannot, everyone has said we cannot do this alone. We have to do this together. And so having the diversity of allies, having the lived experience in the room helps us to ensure that we're moving forward and advancing together. And then the last thing that I think I want to make, just one more thing about the paper that really calls out, is the need to sustain our efforts in the very long term. And so when funders, when individual contributors invest in our work, they are not just investing in the immediate need that needs to happen today, but they have to invest in a multi-year approach. And why is that important? PIF is a perfect example. We started out as a single campaign working on a single issue. This generated so much support across the country, so much interest from our partners at a very local, state, national level. It also created a voice working at the intersection of immigration and public benefits that allowed us to not only work on public charges specifically issue, but it actually pushed us to address other issues that immigrant families were facing when it came within the area of public benefits, whether it was the need for addressing housing and renters, or the need to address, expand nutrition services. And so when you invest, let's not just invest on the issue that is happening at the moment, because that is either gonna end or that we're gonna find a solution, but let's invest in the long-term strategy for systems change. Let's invest in the long-term strategy that actually allows to build power in people, and let's invest so that we can actually build equity and build inclusiveness in our country.
Thank you. So I'm seeing, this has been amazing. There are lots of threads here. I think I'm going to try to merge my questions and some of the ones I'm seeing in the chat, and I would love to see more in the Q&A. There's a great one in the Q&A I'm going to come back to in a second. But what I guess that where I want to start is that you've all given us such a visionary and inspiring picture that I'm a little worried that the people watching are thinking, this isn't what my life is like. It's not easy. Yeah, I want to do coalitions and everybody gets mad at each other, or they've all got different priorities. So I think I'm going to ask you a couple questions to get you to talk about the challenges and maybe how you address them. And let me start with this idea of coalition building, because clearly every one of you and so many people we've talked to in the paper have talked about parents and providers and people deeply engaged in justice work, and people who care more broadly about children and families, and people who work at state levels and in communities and at the federal level. That's a lot of people with different missions and different interests and a lot of work to keep them corralled. So I wonder if a couple of you would talk about the challenges of coalition building, maybe even a story, which we promise we'll keep anonymous, about something that was hard or blew up and how you resolved it. Who's going to be courageous enough to start with challenges?
I can go first.
Okay.
Being new to the organizing world and proposing something that was really radical and but yet revolutionary for our industry. I remember having some conversations about, you know, hey, what does it look like for parents and providers to go on strike? And what does it look like to have solidarity across issues? And being able to handle the different sensitivities that C3 and C4 organizations had to be able to align with this. We knew that they were allies. We knew that they cared about the issue. But for that moment and for that campaign, we were stuck like on our first year of like trying to propose this, and we had to like change the name to something that would help childcare providers who are unionized in New York or California and other areas really be able to participate. But that did not come without us being able to develop our coalition space and really have a space where we were hearing what were the needs of each organization, what were the needs of their base of parents and providers, and then for our supporters, what did they really need to be able to raise this as a broader issue that they could get behind. We did that through so much support from community change. I just want to give a shout out to Meredith Loomis Quinlan, who helped to create that space and lean into coalition principles that we were able to honor among all of us. And that included disability justice, narrative for BIPOC, other identities that we had in the space as well. And I don't think we could have done that. One of our last principles were that we couldn't do everything alone. And we really had to hold each other to that and say, hey, like, let's carry pieces of the work together. But it didn't come without its challenges. So everybody who's in the audience is thinking like, oh, everybody was kumbaya. It was not. But we made it to show the solidarity for that day.
And so I'm hearing an idea about how you, what's the right way to say it? You double down when there are problems as opposed to backing off, right? You talk about them directly, you hear what's on people's minds, and you develop some principles and some ideas. Anybody else? I'll get one more person and then go on to another question. Anybody else with some ideas? Go ahead, Adriana.
Okay. I think that another area to look at this is also finding ways where you may not necessarily come to a full resolution, but be committed to values and be committed to finding a long-term solution, and also finding ways that both different types of ideas or suggestions can coexist. So just to give you a brief glimpse for what that means for us, you know, at PIF, for us, what's important is to ensure that immigrant families have access to public benefits. And so for us, that means that also when we look at proposals in the immigration reform space, that there's some inclusion of including access to support systems. That doesn't necessarily resonate the right way with our partners in the immigrant rights space. And so what we came to identify is that, you know, we will not necessarily, as a coalition, not necessarily oppose any immigration reform bills that would provide status to individuals who are without status in the country, but that in the long term, we would like to see proposals that actually include from the initial start that people have some kind of legal status, the ability to be able to access support systems like Medicaid and SNAP, because at the end of the day, immigrants, you know, who are working families need those support systems to actually thrive.
Thank you very much. I actually want to take this question of connecting people in a further direction suggested by a couple of notes in the chat. Oh, great. There are some additional ones here too. So I'm going to try to come back to those. But one question, many of you advocate, many people here on this panel advocate for particular groups of children who are crucial to our future and who've been marginalized, right? Black children in the South, children in immigrant and mixed status families. And I just want to note for a dialogue going on in the chat that the vast majority of those children are citizens. Probably, I don't know the number, Adriana, of young children, it's in the 90-something%, who are experiencing these obstacles and are crucial to our future. But all of you also have a commitment to how your advocacy to particular groups is connected to a bigger world of advocating for children and for economic and social and racial justice. And I wonder how you address that. One of the questioners is worried that there's a tension between that it's harder to advocate for one group of children if you're also advocating for another. I actually don't think that, but I'm curious how you address that in practice. How do you advocate for children in Black families in the South while also caring about other regions and about other children? How do you advocate for children in immigrant families while also caring about children in low-income families more broadly? How do you make those connections? And if he's willing, I'm going to start with Dorian, because I know you thought deeply about these issues at kind of a national level, and then I'm going to go to everybody else.
It's a perennial question. It's a hard question. I'm curious what my colleagues have to say about it. Maybe I'll just say two things since you put me on the spot, Olivia. One is to, I'll say it this way. Diversity can often be the enemy of solidarity. And just as a principle, and so we have to start by asking the question, who benefits when we're divided? Who benefits when we're divided? Because there are strategic efforts to divide us, what scholars would call strategic racism or strategic sexism, and someone is benefiting from that. So often in conversations we start with who wins, who loses, who is benefiting from us punching down instead of punching up to broader structures of power and exploitation. And then I think the second thing here is, how do we have very difficult conversations with each other? And I think one of the conditions for that has to be relationships of trust. Someone has said to me recently, and I've been hearing this more and more, that relationships are infrastructure, and we need a broad infrastructure to win on very public goods and to win for all of us. And so you can have those difficult conversations from a place of trust, from a place of love. I mean, every parent has to do this with their kid, right? Or with your partner in a relationship. So it's a muscle that I think we're better at now than we were 5, 10, God forbid, 50 years ago, of how to have these hard conversations and not accept the scarcity frame, not accept the frame of division, because we will lose, and we have a graveyard of losses from when we're divided. So the other thing I'll point to, I think Meredith put it in the chat, also in coalitions, having some agreed upon principles to begin with that you can keep coming back to and hold the coalition accountable to is also very important.
I mean, I'm going to add a couple of my own thoughts and then see if other people want to, because I do think that issue of whose advantage is it to divide us is a really important question for groups to reflect on, and it often helps them. I'm going to do a commercial announcement here. I just saw the amazing musical Suffs in New York, and which is about the many decades, 60 plus years for women's suffrage, and it keeps going back to the point that we fight with each other when the enemy is somewhere else. So I think that's a helpful point. But the other thing I want to note, for me at least, speaking as an older white woman, the advantage of having people really reflect on history in order to build that trust, because it's easy sometimes to walk into a room and say, well, why don't you trust me? I haven't done anything to you. But that actually may not be helpful. I'm going to point to the founding of PIF, when part of what we had to think about was that for the immigration world, people who cared about things like healthcare and poverty had over and over traded away the well-being of immigrant families to get something else. And from the perspective of people like the health advocates, who felt as though they were fighting a life and death battle for healthcare, they were scared they were going to be asked to trade away principles that they thought were really important. And so laying out that history in an honest way and then figuring out what we were all going to do to move forward actually was really important to our being able to do that, as opposed to just saying, we're all nice people, why don't we like each other? It was kind of, okay, what's going on here. Does anybody else want to add? I have a few more questions to get to, but I know a lot of people have thought about this.
I just want to add just give me a couple minutes if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Just a couple thoughts here. One, I just want to really build off what you just said. I think it is important for us to really be honest. At the Southern Education Foundation, really, we were founded after the Civil War, after the original sin of our country of having so many people enslaved. and Black people enslaved in this country. And really the childcare industry derived from enslavement, if you think about it as well. And so for me, it's really important that we're just honest about what the situation is and where we've come from over a number of years, 300 and 400 years. Our country is still dealing with the impact of enslavement. And that is the truth. That resonates in this paper. We talk about the poverty rates that exist and the disparity between the poverty rates for white children versus Black children, other children of color. It is completely apparent to me. And so it is important that we are honest. It's also important, at least at the Southern Education Foundation, we advocate for children of color, Black children specifically, and low-income children as well. But being, I guess, pro-Black isn't anti-white. So our understanding is if we continue to advocate for children of color, Black children specifically, it still will benefit all children. But it is our role, I think, specifically to try to address the system of inequities that have been embedded in our nation's history for centuries. And so though there's some discomfort there, I honestly just think that we have to be honest about what the data says, what issues people are dealing with, the resources that they need to succeed. And despite the divisions that we have, there needs to be a very tailored approach to how we resolve these issues. And we saw that come out to play in this relief package and how those efforts benefited disproportionately children of color, I would say. So I just think we have to be honest about what's taking place and what has taken place.
If I could add, that was so powerful, Fred. If I could add, and this, I'm going to draw upon a little bit of my academic hat here, because I always think there's so much to be learned from history. And if we look at history, we see the ways in which our different communities have benefited when we have acted in solidarity. And so, for example, if we think about the civil rights movement, right, of the 60s, which, if you think about that, that was an amazing movement. I wish, anyway, and that led by African Americans, right? And it's not a surprise that it was in 1965, in the midst of that movement, that you had the 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act, which completely removed a whole history of racist immigration policy, right? There was a time, so that intersection of a transformational immigration policy at a time of the civil rights movement, that is no coincidence. So and history is rife with examples of that. History is also rife with examples of how communities people try to pit communities against each other, and to foment conflict. Right. And I think a lot, through misinformation, through stereotyping, through all sorts of things. There's also conscious ways in which folks are also trying to foment this kind of intergroup conflict. And so being aware of those things when they're happening as well, I think just behooves us in moving forward together.
Well, and this may be a topic that we'll want to do a much longer conversation about later. I will encourage people to look at what's on the FCD website. Vivian's recently talked a little bit about some of these issues in the research world, and others of you write about them too. I also think that there's just no way we can have a future for our country without, as Fred said, looking at the data about who children are and what they're experiencing and how the history has held them back despite extraordinary efforts by their parents and communities. Okay, we have about 10 minutes left. I'm going to try to get to 2 questions from the chat, from the Q&A, and then give everybody a chance for a closing sentence. And I'll tell you both questions, and that way maybe you can pick which one you most want to answer. They're related in being practical, because we've been inspiring, we've been visionary. Now we're gonna be practical. So one question is somebody just saying, you've talked a lot about advocacy and about the big picture. What can I do? Where can I start? What's an impactful first step. So I don't think I can tell too much about that, where that person is, but just think about, we have a mix of providers, advocates, parents, policy people, researchers. What advice would you give someone who wants to know where to start? And the second question is some more examples about the federal and state. The person wanted an example from Adriana about a state initiative that gets rid of barriers and then gets adopted at the federal level. I think there are lots of examples about the connection. How do those two fit? So let me ask for comments on a practical next step, or on making this idea of federal state relationships more concrete. And who, Adriana, you haven't talked for a little while. Why don't you start this with either question you want to answer? But I think not both. I think we don't have time for everybody to answer both.
Yeah, I'll start. I did. I'll start on the state and federal connections. I think definitely it's extremely important that we make those connections in terms of pushing changes at a federal level and starting at a state level. I think the best example that I can share with everyone that I shared in the Q&A as well is our approach to remove the 5-year bar for legal permanent residents. So in 1996, through PROWORA, there was an intention to remove access to apply for benefits for legal permanent residents within the first 5 years. It's extremely inequitable. It's been over 26 years now that this law has been in effect. And so what had happened is then at the state level, state advocates started working to remove that barrier at a very state level, where states will then cover those individuals who fall within the 5-year bar. The most recent state to do that has been Michigan, and they're implementing that change right now. And so what that does is that it really creates, it moves up, it surfaces up this issue, and it allows to have greater ammunition. It allows to have greater advocates and allies that we can continue to push to reverse that at a federal level. And so I think that that's where those connections are extremely important, because when we think about the fact that legal permanent residents are still barred from basic needs and basic services, it's just outrageous. And so we need to restore access to that. And that is just one example of other initiatives that are out there, not only just in immigrants, but also in as a whole in general.
I mean, the paper gives a couple of examples in both directions. Paid leave is an example where the, whatever it is now, 12, 13 states, I live in the district, which has paid leave, gave the opportunity to figure out what the implementation and the design of it for when it happens on the national level. And then the example of expanding the child tax credit so it really gets to children with low incomes, which the federal government rolled back after this incredibly successful 2 years, but a bunch of states have continued because that was such a great model. So those are some examples. Who would like to answer either question, what you do practically next? We go to Fred, and then maybe I'll get Britannia in on that question too.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief without understanding more context for the question, but I would say there's 3 quick things I would do. One, try to find an early care educator and ask them what their needs are. What are they dealing with in your local community, and how you may be able to support them. The second entity I would go to is the local school district. Ask them what their plan is to expand high quality early learning programs in your local area, and what you can do to support the success of their strategy. And thirdly, building on that, if you have a local chamber of commerce, ask them that very same question. What is their early learning strategy? How are they going about increasing quality or lowering costs to help the business community in that local community? That will be the first place to start. And so you can get a better sense of what's happening, and then how you may be able to advocate from there.
Those are really interesting ideas. That's really interesting. Britannia, what would you tell somebody to do as their first step?
I would recommend that everybody take a moment to adjust their mindset, right, towards more abundance. We've talked a lot about people thinking that there's not enough resources to go around, but I honestly do. over my time as an organizer, I've understood that the key principles of any organizing model is one, that power is built through relationships and collective action, as Dorian and others have said, and that people are highly motivated by their own self-interest, meaning what are their goals, what are their personal things, and those things, getting clear on those for yourself will help you to find your political home and find where those are echoed within your community, within a national space, and also understanding where you want to become a leader, like where your lane is and how you want to use, again, the power of storytelling to be able to move the needle on a local level within your family and friends, as well as systemically in your state or federally across the nation. So just being able to figure those things out for yourself and learn how to talk about them, making these kind of issues kitchen table politics, like, you know, just bringing it to that space right where you are is always a great place to start.
So I'm going to add two quick things and then let Dorian and Vivian get in. One is that going to the organizations represented on this panel and looking at what they're doing and what connections you could make is another powerful thing to do. And the second thing I'm going to say is that there are many people on this panel, on this webinar who signed up who actually have a lot of deep engagement in one piece of this world, like a researcher or a person who runs a child abuse prevention program or someone in a children's agency in a state. And for you, I would probably suggest that a takeaway is to pick some of the world around you that you don't know well yet and to connect to. Like if you're deep in your state, perhaps look for a national organization that could help you make the connection, or look for a parent connection and so forth. So if you're really deep in one piece, maybe this will help you see some connections. Dorian, what would you like to add?
I think I'll combine Fred and Britannia and say, so if you're looking to join something, and you have two options. You can join some national thing. You can come join Childcare Changemakers at Community Change. So look at Britannia and join her. Or, because Olivia, you introduced me as someone who has like a national perspective. I am a very proud member of a local community organization where I live called Spaces in Action, that is very engaged in the childcare early learning fight here in Washington, D.C. I'm a rank and file member. I'm a dues paying member. I get engaged with my local. So find a local community organization in your community to join.
And I just did testimony before the DC Council for that exact reason. It's so useful to be paying attention to the connections. Vivian?
Well, I have to speak from a funder perspective, right?
Please do.
And so I think if there are funders on this webinar who are thinking about what's a starting point or how do I get from my starting point to the next level, I think, I have been so touched by just understanding the lessons learned from organizers, advocates, movement, and coalition leaders, the people who've been laying the groundwork for all of this work. And I think as funders, one of the best things we can do is to ground ourselves in what are the lessons learned from the people on the front lines of this work and what do they say they need. So I would say reaching out, understanding maybe you're amongst your own grantees, and doing a lot of deep listening and learning over time, which is an organizing tactic, right? And then I would say amongst us as funders, we could also do more conversations with each other and organize with each other around what can we do, what's our role to support the folks who are on the front lines of change. And so this is my open welcome invitation to any funders who are on the webinar who would like to have some follow-up conversations with us and think about how we can organize ourselves to be better supporters and play our role even better as part of these larger movements.
Well, thank you. I think I'm going to treat that as closing remarks from each of the panelists because we're at our closing time. There's clearly so much more to talk about. You've been an incredible audience with all the ideas. And just take a moment to help me thank this incredible panel who I want to clap for. They've just been amazing. So thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to turn it over for a final close to Joanne. There you are.
Hi. Hi,
Hi.
all.
And
I am the Vice President of Program and Communications at the Foundation for Child Development. And I just want to echo everything that Vivian has said. And thank you all so much for an engaging, enriching discussion. And Olivia for masterfully facilitating this to take us both from the big picture, inspiring ideation and reality to also the practical of what can we each individually do in our own roles and in our own lives. I mean, the personal is powerful and the relationships are infrastructure are points that I'm going to take with me. And I know I'll be looking at this webinar again. It will be on the FCD website and on YouTube. And really, this is just the start of the journey that the foundation is going on to explore in dialogue and discourse with all of you and others, and learning from diverse perspectives about how we can champion social justice and center young children who have been marginalized by injustice. And I invite you to look at our blog series. I invite all of you to continue on with this journey with us. And I thank you again. So with that, I will turn it back over to you, Olivia, and stay tuned.
thank you so much. And with that, we'll close the webinar. Thank you to everybody. Take care.